Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and absolutely demystify one of the most infamous texts in human history. Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince has this incredibly sinister reputation, right? It's almost always associated with deceit, backstabbing, and total ruthlessness. But today, we're going to strip away all that stigma. We're going to look at this text not as some cartoon villain's manifesto, but as a deeply pragmatic, unflinching observation of human nature and political survival. We're popping the hood to see the actual mechanics of power. We're going to jump straight into the uncompromising reality of this text. Just listen to this chilling logic. Machiavelli says, men ought either to be well treated or crushed. Basically, if you're going to injure someone, you have to do it so severely that you literally don't have to worry about them getting revenge. It's brutal, for sure, but to Machiavelli, he was just observing the chessboard of 16th century statecraft. This was simply how empires were secured. But to really get the book, we have to understand the man behind it. His life fell into three distinct eras, completely tied to the crazy, turbulent fortunes of Florence, Italy. Look, he wasn't just some armchair philosopher sitting in an ivory tower. During the Republic years, he was a diplomat out in the trenches. He rode across Europe, negotiating face-to-face with kings and popes. But then, in 1512, the Medici family came back to power. Machiavelli was fired, accused of conspiracy, thrown in a cell, and even tortured, before finally being exiled to a tiny property out in the country. And this period of exile is absolutely fascinating. He wrote this famous letter about his days spent covered in the mud and dust of the country. But when evening rolled around, he'd go home, peel off those dirty peasant clothes, and actually put on his noble court dress. He'd step into his study just to commune with the ancient courts of the men of old. He said for 4 hours he felt no weariness and forgot every trouble. It was in that exact headspace, desperately trying to prove his worth and win his old job back from the Medici, that he wrote The Prince. Part 1. The Foundations of Power, Acquiring and Holding States. Let's see how he breaks down the very bedrock of political survival. He starts by categorizing states. Hereditary states? Super easy. Just don't mess with the ancestral customs and you're golden. But that middle category, mixed principalities, where you annex a new territory to an existing one, those are incredibly troublesome. And the psychology here is brilliant. People willingly change their rulers, hoping to better themselves, right? They literally take up arms against their current boss. But then they realize, usually the hard way, that things just went from bad to worse, because the new prince inevitably has to tax them and burden them with his military. To show how you completely botch holding one of these mixed states, he uses King Louis XII's invasion of Italy as a step-by-step checklist of what not to do. The king made 5 massive errors. He crushed the weak minor powers who actually wanted to be his allies. He pumped up an already massive power, the church. He invited the king of Spain into Italy, and he didn't even bother moving to the territory himself, nor did he send cheap colonies of his own citizens to hold it. By missing all those red flags, Louis lost Milan incredibly fast. So this sets up one of his most crucial concepts, the contrast between relying on your own intrinsic ability, what he calls virtù, versus the totally fickle winds of fortune. Rulers who rise by their own grit, like Moses or Cyrus, face immense difficulties up front, mainly because they're upending the status quo. But once they're in, they hold power easily. Then you have guys like Cesare Borgia. He rose entirely on the luck and military muscle of his father, the Pope. Borgia did literally everything right to build a solid foundation, but when his father suddenly died and he fell deathly ill at the exact same time, his whole empire evaporated. He was completely undone by the extreme malignity of fortune. Part 2. The Morality of Power. Fortune, Ability, and Wickedness. This is where we get into the really juicy stuff and leave conventional morality at the door. He looks at rulers who gained their empires entirely through wicked, nefarious crimes, and he analyzes them totally impartially just as case studies. Take Agathocles, the Sicilian, son of a potter, rose up through the military. One morning, he calls a meeting with the people and the Senate of Syracuse. Then, at a given signal, his soldiers just slaughter all the senators and the richest citizens. Boom, he seizes the princedom with zero civil pushback. Machiavelli explicitly says, hey, we can't call it virtue to murder your fellow citizens and be completely devoid of mercy. That gets you empire, not glory. But he openly admits that it undeniably worked. Building on that, he makes this incredibly cold, logical argument that there is a proper way and a bad way to use cruelty. If you're a usurper, you have to figure out all the injuries you need to inflict and do them all at once. Rip the Band-Aid off. Because they're tasted less, they offend less, and you don't have to keep a knife in your hand every single day. Severities are badly used if they start small and just keep multiplying over time. On the flip side, any benefits or favors? Hand those out little by little so their flavor actually lasts. Now, what if you get your power through the favor of your peers? He calls this a civil principality, and his advice here is a real game changer. He proves that siding with the common people is vastly more stable than relying on ambitious nobles. Nobles think they're your equals, and their whole goal is to oppress others. But the common people? Their goal is far more righteous. They just want to be left alone. They just desire not to be oppressed. A prince is doomed against a hostile public because there are just too many of them, but you can always secure yourself against a handful of angry nobles. Part 3. The defense of power, the danger of mercenaries. Let's pivot to the military side of things and his absolute disgust for outsourced armies. He observes that relying on mercenary or auxiliary troops is worse than useless. It's practically a death sentence. Mercenaries are unfaithful, undisciplined, and entirely self-serving. They talk a big game around their friends, but they're cowards when the enemy actually shows up. Think about it. If you pay foreigners to fight for you, they'll rob you blind during peacetime and sprint the other way in a war because a tiny paycheck isn't enough to make a man want to die for you. He insists the only secure foundation is your own arms, an army made entirely of your own citizens. He actually blames mercenaries for completely ruining Italy. It left the region so incredibly weak and fractured that foreign kings could basically just waltz in. He quotes this dark, almost funny quip about King Charles of France. When Charles invaded, he supposedly just strolled through Italy with a piece of chalk in his hand, marking the doors where his soldiers were going to sleep. He didn't even have to draw his sword. That's the tragic, slightly absurd reality of outsourcing your own defense. Because the world is so dangerous, he asserts that a ruler has to be totally obsessed with the art of war, especially when things are peaceful. You have to be ready when your luck runs out. A prince shouldn't just run military drills. He needs to be out hunting, getting used to physical hardship, and literally memorizing the local geography. The hills, the valleys, the marshes, knowing your terrain is everything. And mentally, read history. Study the greatest winners and losers of the past so you can imitate the absolute best. Part 4. The ruler's true image, liberality, and meanness. Okay, let's explore how a leader should manage their public relations, because this is where he completely shatters all the classical ideals of a good king. First off, he completely rejects utopian daydreams. Lots of writers before him imagined these perfect, ideal republics that never actually existed anywhere. Machiavelli says, look, if you try to act perfectly virtuous in a real world packed full of evil people, you are going to get destroyed. A prince who actually wants to survive has to learn how not to be good, and then strategically use that knowledge or hide it based purely on what the situation demands. Which brings us to a fascinating paradox about generosity, or what he calls liberality. If you want everyone to think you're super generous, you have to spend a ton of money. Eventually, you go broke, and you have to tax your citizens into the ground just to keep the party going. You end up hated by the many just to impress the few. But a mean or frugal ruler, they live within their means. When a crisis hits, they actually have the cash to defend the state without squeezing the public. So by being cheap, you're actually practicing the truest form of generosity to the vast majority of your people. And that sets up his most famous, totally provocative cliffhanger. The ultimate question, is it better to be loved or feared? He admits it'd be great to be both, but that's practically impossible. And here's his cynical truth. Men are generally ungrateful, fickle, and greedy. Love is just a bond of obligation, and people will snap that bond the second they get a better offer. But fear? Fear is maintained by a dread of punishment, and that never fails. So, if you have to pick one, it is vastly safer to be feared than loved, as long as you don't push it so far that you become universally hated. So, we've walked through the whole shebang, from ruthless power grabs to public image management. And I want to leave you with a question to chew on. Is the brutal, pragmatic playbook we just explored in this explainer just a dusty relic of 16th century Italy? Or does it perfectly describe the eternal, unchanging reality of human nature and political power today? Are we all, deep down, still operating by Machiavelli's rules?